So I think it's maybe best to just ask you a little bit about your background, where you were born and what your household was like growing up.
All right. I was born in the city of Grudek, which they call Horodok. Right. My grandfather was Rav there. He was Rebelio Ben Sion Garber. He was, my grandmother is a sister to Rebbe Bear. And I was born there, and then my parents moved. My father became Rav in the city of Seini, which is on the border between Germany and Lithuania. And I was born there, and I lived there till I was around 12 years old when the war broke out. And in the meantime, I spent some time with my grandparents. My grandfather was this Rav in that city. I had a young uncle who died. He was 19 years of age. He had a ruptured appendix. And my mother sent me to my grandparents for the summer to make them a little bit freiler, to entertain them. And at the end, they told me that I'm going to stay there for a whole year. And like I told all my kids in school, that years ago, children did not question their parents. And I stayed there the whole year. And it was quite lonely at times, but for my grandparents, I learned a lot from the Hanhogo, from my grandparents. And I went home at the end of the summer, and the following September, the war broke out.
Very interesting. Okay. Everything okay? Mm-hmm. Okay. So you were living on the Lithuanian-German border.
Right.
And the war broke out. So your family prepared to make some kind of a move.
Well, I don't know if they prepared. I don't know what they thought. I was a child, so they didn't share with me everything. But what happened was that when the war broke out, they decided, especially my father, they decided to move on. And they couldn't, there was no transportation anymore because all the buses and all the trains and all the planes were taken over. I don't know planes, but were taken over by the Poles in the war. So they hired a horse and a buggy. And they they couldn't take too many belongings. Number one, because they didn't have room for it. Number two is because they felt they would be coming back in a couple of weeks. I remember my mother made a lot of jam, so she packed it up and she put it in like they used to have in Europe, like an oven in there. She put it in, so when we come back, my father put away his foreign, and my grandmother was with us. And we traveled some more families together on a couple wagons. The children, the older people were sitting, and in the wagon, the children were walking on the sides. And this is how and actually, where they wanted to go is where my grandfather was on the Russian border. Because they wanted to go away as far from the Germans as they could, without them realizing that the Germans could get any place. So we passed the city of Grodno, and then we passed more cities, and on the way there were bombs. The Germans bombs, and we were running into the forests, which was the most dangerous thing to do, because the Germans knew that the refugees are in the forests, and this is where they bombed. On the road, we didn't know where my parents were. I have a brother, just two of us. We didn't know where my parents were. And we looked for them a whole day till finally at the end of the day we found them. So we came to the city of Grodno, and then there was another city, Sapotskin. They were all, and that's how we traveled back and towards the city where my grandfather lived.
And what did they tell you was going on? Why were you going?
We're just running away from, there's a war. There were no radios there. We knew there was a war. And we're just running away. And when children are with their parents, children don't question much. They feel such a safety with their parents that we didn't question. I just know one thing. I remember the first night when we slept in the village, and they gave me as a mattress, they gave me a straw sack. And I I felt I longed to be at home. I said, oh, now I wish my mother would tell me to go to sleep, and I would go gladly. And this is what I remember, sleeping on that sack, without any pillows, without any blankets, and so forth. And we traveled on. And then we came to the city of Zelve. I had an uncle, Rabbi Kosovsky. I don't know if you heard about him. He was in South Africa later on. So we stopped there. And there we were a couple days, a short time. And we decided, we found out, I mean, my parents found out that the Germans are coming. So they, closer, so they decided to go further to where my grandfather was. My uncle and we were traveling by the horse and buggies further on. On the way, my mother spoke Russian. So she noticed that there were a lot of Russian uniformed men, and we didn't know what happened. This is where Russia and Germany made a pact, and they divided Poland amongst themselves. And I mean, this is in the history. And so we were stopped. We were stopped once by the Russian soldiers, and they started blaming my father and my uncle that they were rabbis, and they said papi, papi, they're popes, they call them popes, and that they were oppressed the poor people. That was their, and there really was no law and order, you know, there was just like, and my mother, no matter she knew Russian, no matter what she told them, it didn't help. They kept saying. Finally, they took everything that they belonged, like the watch. My mother had a watch, I had a watch, my father had a watch, any jewelry. And so we thought we're finished with them. They took our jewelry and they will not do anything else. So we traveled further. And then so my father and my uncle put on caps. Instead of hats, they put on those caps. So they would not blame them. They would not realize that they are rabbis. We came further on and we were stopped again. There they started asking questions again and again with the same accusation that the rabbis oppressed the poor. And they said, no matter what my mother said, it didn't help. And they took down, and then they said, well, they have to go to court and we'll take care of them. Court in those days meant that you took them in a barn someplace, you put them against the wall, you asked them a couple of questions, and boom, and they shot them. So naturally we kids started crying, everyone's crying, and all of a sudden, and this I'm telling you because I think it's a lesson and I will explain. All of a sudden my mother saw that a group of people, that a man came forward and everyone goes up to him and they treat him so royally, and so she decided that he must be a very important man. So she ran up to him and he asked her, what's going on? So she told him this story. She said, they accuse our husband, they accuse them of not being good to the poor, and it's not so. So he says to them, to all the people around, she's right. She says, that's true, the rabbis did help the people. Then he tells this story. He was a communist for 6 years. And before the war, communists were outlawed in Poland. They put him to jail. So he was in jail for 6 years. The rabbi of that city, and I don't remember the name of the city, I think it's Ghetto, but I'm not sure, sent food to all the Jewish communists that were in jail. And he gave a message that if there is anyone else in jail that doesn't have enough food, they should share it. So he said, because of that, this is what the man said, because of that rabbi, I was in jail, I benefited from him. So you see, it's not true that the rabbis are. This is what he said. And he said to my mother, he said to the people, let him go. And then he said to my mother, we should not go through villages, we should go through the cities. And I still remember that man, it happened around 60 years ago. He had a patch on an eye, he must have been Elio Anovi, and he saved generations. So I always say, Shlach lach mechol pnei hamayim. You have to, you never know, you do a chesed, you never know what will come out of it. So this is with this man, this is what happened. So we traveled. Then my parents decided no use traveling anymore. We might as well go back. So we went back to where my uncle lived, and we stayed there it was a sukkahs. We stayed there for sukkahs, and they had a sukkah which you lifted up the roof. So they were afraid to eat there because the Russians will see it. So they ate at night, and at night they lifted up the thing. There also something happened which, mamish, I consider it a nace. There was a Jew, a communist, who sat in jail, and then he let free. And my uncle didn't. I mean, he was the Rav, and naturally he gave Musar, and he didn't like it. So one morning, my aunt opens up the door, and she sees a man stands there with a gun, and he says to her, "Rebbetzin, don't be afraid. I came to tell you that they're going to come and get the Rav, which is my uncle and my father, and they'll take him to court. And you know what happens when they take him to court. Therefore, I'm advising you that they should go into hiding." Now, this was a man that was really considered my uncle his enemy, but a Jew is always a Jew. Those two incidents stick out and I say it very often to my students. I tell them the story.
Very nice. Okay. Did you had brothers?
I have one brother who lives in Chicago, Rabbi Benjamin Rogoff.
Rogoff. Okay. I'm from Chicago. So.
Oh, so my father was a Rosh Yeshiva in Skokie many years ago.
Really? I have a boy now learning in Skokie.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah, my father was there. Rabbi Rogoff.
Rogoff, okay. I know a Rogoff in Passaic, New Jersey, but
Could be.
be. So, at this time, while you're moving around. This is what year, probably?
That was been in 1939. I don't remember exactly. It was in 19... This is where we realized we have no place to go. I say we, my parents. My parents realized they cannot go back to their own city because that was taken over by the Germans. So we stayed for a while by my uncle. In the meantime, I don't know how they found out, but they found out that Vilna, the city of Vilna, you probably heard about it, was taken over. Russia gave it back to the Lithuanians. And that Vilna is now a free city. So naturally everyone wanted to go. My father felt that he has nothing to lose. He has no place to go back. He might as well. That's when we went. And I don't know how they got on the train, because there were so many people going. Must have been a nest. And we went to Vilna.
I see, from your uncle's house.
We was in Zelva, the city of Zelva.
And what was happening in Vilna at the time?
In Vilna, what's happening is that the Lithuanians, the Russians, and then Lithuanians took over. Now, at that time, nobody understood what happened. Why the Lithuanians? And there was another story, which is, I think, in one of this forum, I think, that in the books that I read, that a couple years before that, Lithuania and Poland were at war. You probably heard it. And all of a sudden, Poland wanted, and they were really at war, and Poland wanted to make peace treaty. And they didn't want, Lithuania didn't want, but they insisted on a peace treaty, and they insisted on building a train, a train from Vilna to Kovne, the city, and nobody realized what it was. But later on, they found out that this train is where the refugees. Later on, we will talk about later. They went on this train, so it was prepared ahead. Wow. Those were the Nisim.
Okay, so how long did you stay in Vilna? What was
a year, almost a year. After a year, in Vilna we settled, and we rented a place, an apartment, by a lady, and we lived together with her. There were 2 bedrooms, and a kitchen, small kitchen. We lived there for a year, and life went on. The refugees and somehow or other, life goes on. And that's when all of a sudden one morning we got up and we hear the rumbling of tanks. The Russians came back. Then we understood why the Russians gave over Vilna to Lithuania, because they put the foot in the door, and then they had the rest, and they took over the whole Lithuania. So again, we stayed in Vilna. And my father was offered a position as a Rav before that, but he didn't take it, which was very good he didn't, otherwise we would have been stuck there. And we decided to stay under Russian rule, and we learned. I remember there came a man, he taught us, because everyone had to be productive there, everyone had to do something. He taught us how to make paper bags. My mother bought a machine, so she could knit on the machine. And we thought, and then started the news about Vilna, and nobody could leave. And not only couldn't we leave, we were afraid that once the Russians find out that we ran away from them originally, they will be very... So that's when you start the story with the people that left Lithuania started for Japan. So we, my parents, they were trapped, but you know, as a child, I didn't feel it so much. Because, as I said before, parents didn't share certain things with their children years ago. So, and I did not feel the fear because my parents did not show us their fear. I remember my mother used to knit a lot, not because of pleasure, but because we, you know. So I remember the peace in the house, that my father was learning, my mother was knitting. So it felt very peaceful. But we were not, I don't remember being frightened. I don't remember being in a panic. And I think this is due to my parents. But they were trapped. Where could they go? But in Soras Rabim, they were not the only ones. And we said, Soras Rabim Chatzin Homo. So everyone else was in the same position. And there was, you heard about Reb Chaim Moiser Grudzinski in Vilna, who did so much. And people, they helped each other.
Did your family ever have contact with him?
With Reb Chaim Moiser, my father was very close to him.
In what way? When did they?
My father learned, many years before he had a koilel, Reb Chaim Moiser's koilel. My father learned there. And my father was close to him. He would go there but we lived a whole year like this with the Russian, maybe less than a year. And we didn't know what would happen. Mamish didn't know what would happen. My grandfather, before that, the borders were closed. You couldn't get out from Russia when Vilna would belong to Lithuania. And my grandfather was stuck there. And then I don't know if you heard the expression, gegamvet dem grenetz. They stole, in English means they stole the border. It means they came at night. They came from where they lived to Vilna, because they felt that Vilna is going to be freedom there, until the Russians took it off.
I'm sorry, who's they though?
My Zayd.
Oh, your Zayd.
My grandfather, Rabbi Garber.
Okay, and so now enters a new Tekufa.
Now enters the new Tekufa again, we're in the same position as we were before, so we're stuck with the Russians, and the yeshivas, Mira Yeshiva was in Vilna, and Kamenitsa Yeshiva, they spread themselves, and they went in the smaller towns. This is where they stayed, because they didn't want to be, there was Kedan, and there was other cities that they stayed. And we waited, and people, I don't know, they just tried to make the best of it. And being in fear, a lot of people were sent to Siberia, and which was the best thing for them, because if they would have stayed then in the long run. And we waited until they found out that all of a sudden that Russia is going to, if anyone has a stateless passport, now it can get out of Russia. But the people have to have an end visa. End visa means destination. Now, who is going to let them in? America is not going to let them in so easy. There's no country that wanted the Jews then. So I don't know, so they found out from, I don't know exactly, they found out from a Dutch yeshiva bocher that there is Curacao, which belonged to the South America. Curacao will give you an end visa for, I think, 2 or 5 lit, which was like $5. And with that piece of paper, you can get a transit visa to go to Japan. And Japan will let you stay there 7 days, and then you go wherever you want, go to Curacao. Nobody wanted to go to South America. You didn't find an answer. So what did they do? They went anyway. There was a man of Sugihara, everyone heard about him, and he gave, and that thing that you had an end visa, he gave a transit visa. And they were able to, and people used it, and only stateless people that were not stateless, that had citizenship, were not allowed to.
And how did your family figure into this? They were stateless.
We were stateless. We didn't, because our city was taken over by the Germans, and so we have no place to go. And Russia was already not so good with the Germans anymore. And so we were considered stateless. So my grandfather was once a Rov in the by the Lithuanians. Now, there was a danger of being stateless by the Russians because they knew that you ran away from them. So my grandfather became a Lithuanian citizen. But then when everyone started, to be a Lithuanian citizen is not such a good thing. So he was changed it. They changed it, I know how they did it, but they did it. And he became a stateless person. And later on, when we were going away, he couldn't get out because he couldn't find his papers. So he had to go back, and we got out.
And so were you among the people who used these Curacao visas?
My father went to Kovne.
How did he?
Well, if they found out, people talk to each other, and he went to Kovne, and he got the visa for my family.
I'm sorry. So your father actually walked into Sugihara's office. Tell me.
Yeah, they were standing outside, and they tell many stories how he gave them the. People stand outside and they handed them over, but I don't know exactly what happened. But he was able to buy the visa for 3 lit, 2 lit, for money. And a lot of people did it, and a lot of people did not do it because they thought it was scam. They thought it was, again, something that the Russians want to, do something to you, accuse you of. And my mother prepared herself for the trip. The trip was we had to go to Kovne to get a visa, and from Kovne we took a train to Vladivostok, which is a couple of weeks, I think exactly. And from there, in Vladivostok, we had a boat, which was a kettle boat, and with that kettle boat we came to Japan.
And where there was a concern, I heard from many people that as they crossed, it was called, I think, the Trans-Siberian Railroad.
Right, yeah.
Now, so there were 2 ways to do it. There was the fancy in-tourist way, or you could go by,
Yeah, we didn't go the fancy way. We were sitting in the train, and
do you remember the ride?
Yeah, I still remember. And people, it's very interesting how people react. The fear of something is worse than the thing itself. And the people were, and again, could be because I was young and I was with my parents. My parents might have been afraid. They tell a story about my mother that came Shabbos. They tell the story about a couple people, but I heard it, that when it came Shabbos and everyone felt dejected, and so she said, whether train or no train, it's Shabbos today, and she took a towel and she covered the little table was between the train, and it was white towel, and it was Shabbos. So they were interested. So there was a lady that wanted a scrambled egg, and she wanted it so badly. And we passed by I don't know if it's, we passed by a city where they went down to get water, hot water they sold on the way. So I don't know how she got a match, and I don't know what happened. She got an egg, and she made a scrambled egg. So, that's human interest, human thing.
Mm-hmm. So,
Boat, and they counted us in the middle of the night. It was on Purim, I believe. Somebody came and counted it. There was a danger of that boat drowning. And then I think they said a couple more, the boat took a couple more people, a couple more rides, and it drowned, it sank. It was a real rickety old boat. A little, a kettle boat. Then we came to Japan.
And what did you find there? What was that like?
Kobe, Japan was it's a different country altogether. I mean, we were fascinated by the Japanese. The Japanese were very friendly to us, even though later on as an occupational army they were terrible, but as an army. And there were Jews in Kobe, and they welcomed us, and they're business people. They lived in Kobe, and they put us in houses. Let's say it's like you would take here a single house, and in every room they put in another family. So when we came, the house was full. We were in the kitchen. And the people that had little children, and there were not too many families with little children, they wanted to get through the kitchen, but they were not happy when we came to take over the kitchen. And this is where everyone waited to get out of there. But they go club. I don't know if they do it now with their wooden shoes. And at night, it was like a different feeling when you were in Japan.
You didn't have.
We didn't have, for instance, they were at war with China, so everything was rationed there. Rice, I had to go and beg for rice. They didn't have anything, and bread. Their bread was like white, made from flour. Right? They were at war, but they treated us in Japan, they treated us very well. And not only this, but they prolonged our transit from 7 days to 6 months.
Why?
I don't know. Because I guess they told them they're waiting for a visa. And America didn't let in so fast. In East to Israel, there was Palestine, you couldn't go, so they wouldn't let you in. So you were stuck. So you were stuck in Japan. Quite a few people were able to go to America, and some people didn't. Like my family was not able yet. So at the end, after 6 months, they said enough, and they sent us to Shanghai. And the reason they say they sent us there is because they were already influenced by the Germans. They already had something to do with the Nazis. And we ended up in Shanghai.
What's the connection?
Why Shanghai?
Well, or why understanding the Germans would have them send you to Shanghai? What was that?
Because they planned a lot of things. I read the other day that the Japanese planned with the probing of the Germans. I mean, they pushed it off to make camps outside of Shanghai. I don't know what they had in mind, but they wanted to get rid of us, the Japanese, and the only place is Shanghai, because Shanghai was an international city. You didn't need a visa there.
And so how old were you when you got to Shanghai?
It was a year later, maybe a year, a little bit, in a couple months. So when we came to Shanghai again, we were refugees right there, there. So in Shanghai, Shanghai was divided into 3 parts. There was the Hongqiu part, which is the Chinese. Then there was the British part, Bund, and then they had the French. So the French, you had all the well-to-do people. In the Bund, they had all the offices. And in Hongqiu, they had all the Chinese, the dirty, the poor people. And we lived in Hongqiu. So I remember from Shanghai, Shanghai was, where we lived, very dirty city. You would go in the morning, you would find people would leave the babies outside, little tiny, that they couldn't afford to raise, so they would leave them on the street. And people that couldn't, there was no middle class by the Chinese. There was either you were very poor or you were rich. So the poor people, I had an aunt when she went shopping in the morning to the market, so she always came home and threw up, because on the way, what she saw. But again, you get used to, we lived with the Chinese together in a house. The Chinese had one room and we had another room, and they used to play mahjong a whole night. So we used to hear the clapping, clap, 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 clap. And that's how we lived. And a very, and then there was a ghetto. I think that's when it was very, after a while, they came up with the idea that the Japanese were, as I said before, they were in war, and they had the power, the Japanese. They gave out an idea, this was their idea, that they made a ghetto. They didn't call it a ghetto. They only said that people that came to Shanghai from 1937 have to live in special places. Okay, they didn't say the Jews. They said, so what happened? So let's say if you had a street and then it was very hot in Shanghai. People lived in one room. It was dirty. So you go to the park and you get a little fresh air. So if there was, let's say, a park across the street, they would close it up. You cannot cross. So in other words, there were times when we could not cross the street. And the Mira Yeshiva had permission to learn in the English, in the British part. And they had to have a passport, a pass in order to pass. And anyone that went to business or whatever could not go to the other parts of the city without a pass. Now it just happened that a person that gave out the passes was a very short man, really very short. If a tall person came for this pass, he was in danger. And he had a change of mood. Sometimes he was very good, and sometimes I don't know what happened. He was there. So he would get up in a little stool and get up and start punching the person back and forth. And it was dangerous. He put you in jail. And the jail in Shanghai was full of parasites and people got sick. And he even had the Mira Rosh Yeshiva, Rav Shmulevitz Zatzal, and the Mira Mashgiach, he even had them in jail. So you lived under such condition. How you survive? I don't know. You survived. There was and then came Pearl Harbor attack. So my husband had a visa before Pearl Harbor. 25 Boharim from Mira Yeshiva, I think a couple Younger Light, got visas to Canada. My husband was one of them. And his things, I think his things were already on the boat, and he stayed for Shabbos, and this is where Pearl Harbor started, and the people were stuck again. They were stuck for another 4 years, maybe 5 years. So this is when really people were really hopeless. They were, because what are we going to do? America is at war with Japan, so how are we going to live? The joint, who's going to? And I think for quite a few months, people were really desperate. But the Rebbeinu Shalom helped, and they sent money through Switzerland, and somehow the joint, an American joint, and I think the Vadat Sola, all these organizations. And we lived on people's, what people gave us. Okay, so they were the Joint Distribution Committee, right? And the Vadat Sola. I don't know if the Vadat Sola was there already or not, but private people and money was sent through Switzerland. They made like exchange. And after that, so, right, became a little bit easier already. But we didn't, I don't think I drank milk for a couple of years. We had a lot of soya products. And little by little, things stabilized. I mean, it wasn't that great, but at least I went to school there. I was of school age. And there was a Mr. Kaduri. I don't know if you heard about him. He was from India, I think. He did business. He opened up the school. There were children mostly from German descent, from Jewish, but from Germany. And we didn't have too many young kids from Lithuania, from where I come. So we went to school there. And that's where we learned English. And I remember I wanted to read the book very badly. And I didn't know maybe a sentence or two. So I started to read the book, and I had to look in the dictionary all the time. I decided, then I said, no, I'm going to read it anyway. So I read without understand, but from the context, and that's how I learned English. I always tell it to the kids, they should do it the same thing. But so I went to school, and life went on. And quite a few people got married there.
Oh, really?
People that came from Poland, from Vilna, and they came as husband. For instance, let's say a bocher had a visa, and a girl had to get out. So he took her as his wife, all in fiction. And then, but then a few of them got married like that after a while. Not a few, quite a few. Well, the people in Shanghai were very close to one another, right? And the Boharim there, in the Mira Yeshiva, many of them ate in married people's houses. You know, they were very close to each other. So everyone knew was doing by everybody else. You know how it is. And that we knew because not only the Yeshiva Boharim had to go out of to have a pass, but even any person that, let's say my father wanted to go to the French section for some reason, the Rov, to see the Rov, Rav Ashkenazi, who was the Rov there, so you had to have a pass in order to get there. You couldn't go without a pass outside of your boundaries that they've set up for you. And if you went and they caught you, you were in trouble.
And did somebody get a pass? How did you do that?
Oh, so you had to go to Mr. Goya, his name, the Chinese man, the Japanese man that I told you about, and you had to give him the reason why he needs the visa. Let's say people worked in the French section, so he got a visa, I call it a visa, he got a pass. Let's say if I wanted to go there for a day or two, I had to go. And sometimes you didn't want to go because you knew what was waiting for you. So you would go without a pass. You take that, and then you were in trouble. Mm-hmm. So they went, I forgot the name of the shul. You must have had the shul, the yeshiva. Yeah, that's what it was. It's built by a Sephardi Jew. And they say that he had a dream. This rich man had a dream. The Chacham came to him and told him that he should build a shul. He wasn't even a frum person. And he didn't know, he had a dream, he got scared, so he built it, and this was where the yeshiva learned. And later on, they moved to Hongju. I guess that was the next step where they didn't even give you a pass, they moved to Hongju.
Mm-hmm. And so tell me, how did the Beis Yaakov develop?
Okay, so there were quite a few young people. They were not from Lithuania, from the people, there were not too many, a handful. But there were German Jews from Germany that came to Shanghai, and they had families. So there were people amongst that tried to be mikar of them, and they opened up a school for them. Now, there were not too many children from Jews that came from Poland or Lithuania, but there were quite a few from the Jews that came from Germany. And boys, there was, people tried to have a, the place of learning. And that's why they opened up a yeshiva ktana, and then the Bisyakov, and the women that were there. At that time, I already was older. I must have been around 17, and I was teaching the little kids. And Miss Rebbe Basia Shafran, she was there, and my aunt that was there. There were a few, around 6, 7 women. I was still not married, and that's how the Bisyakov started. And they Shabbos especially, they brought the kids, sweets and stuff, which they were very happy to get. And the same was with the boys. They had a yeshiva ktana there.
So how did you meet your husband?
My husband was, we were, in Shanghai, there was one big family. My husband used to come quite often to my father to speak in learning. So, he was a bimbai, he was in the house, and everyone so close together to finally suggested it, my husband, and and the end was that we were married. We were married a month before we left Shanghai. We were married after the war. So he, in fact, as I told you before, he had a visa to go to Canada. And because of the Pearl Harbor, he was stuck. He was stuck to another 4 years. So now after the war, he put me on his visa, and I was able to get out. My parents still stayed there for a while, a couple months, and then they came to Chicago.
I see. Okay, I'm going to ask you now a little bit more about the Beis Yaakov. Mm-hmm. You mentioned that in many ways it was a kiruv program as much as it was a regular Beis Yaakov.
Right.
So, first of all, how many girls were there, maybe?
Quite a few. It must be 100 girls at least, with little ones, older ones. There was a big picture. I don't know if you saw it. You saw it. So that was, you can see how many children, but they're different ages. Different ages. And, you had them for Shabbos, and you had them, it was a rough time for the kids. So that was a Beis Yaakov, and they learned there.
Was there anything unusual in their learning, or was it regular Seder Hayom?
A regular Seder. Well, not exactly, but it was like, I think it was regular. I remember they started off with the tefillah when I had little girls. And in fact, I still have a little card that they sent me with flowers before I went on the boat. And so there were quite a few little girls. And the boys were there. But when I say kiruv, I meant that you had to get them together. There were parents, not all parents were frum. And so you had to be mikar of them. But things, after a couple years, when Pearl Harbor attacked, after Pearl Harbor, things stabilized a little. The people knew that they are stuck. And then there was a shoichet in Shanghai, there was a rov in Shanghai, Rav Ashkenazi.
What did you do about kosher food? How did
they shechted, they had a shoichet from before. There was quite a large kehillah of Lubavitcher, and there was also people that came from Germany before that, and people that came from India, merchants and so forth. They lived on the French section. Rabbi Ashkenazi was the Rav, was a very special person, and the yeshiva was there, and life began. There was a lot of action there. But at the end, much later, the bomb started. the Americans started to bomb Shanghai. And at the end of the war, almost at the end of the war. And they sent, there was no place to run because the houses were so flimsy, they was built so, there was a danger to stay inside. There was only one little corner that they said that it was cement was there. This is where you could stay. So what did people do? They ran. They ran out of the houses and they ran to a school. And they told us that that school is safe. And then later on we found out that that school had full of ammunition. And they told us to run there because they felt if the Americans will know that there are refugees there, they will not bomb it. So we were there.
Interesting.
And it was the last couple of weeks before the end of war were very rough. In the middle of the night, the bombs started falling, and many people, were killed and so forth.
Mm-hmm. They have any?
Yeah, sure. They were talking about it, and I had a Chinese teacher in school, and we were not interested to learn the language because we knew that we're not going to stay long there, but we had a Chinese teacher. And maybe I shouldn't even talk about it, but this Chinese teacher was always, this is a funny thing, he was always burping. And we kids were always laughing. Till finally he asked us why we were laughing. So we told him. So he told us that by the Chinese, it's a sign that you had enough to eat and that you are prosperous and it's nothing terrible. So we lived in a culture, we were in such a different culture. And there were quite a few people that did business, with other countries. Even not the Chinese, but the Chinese we really couldn't. It was such a different culture. You couldn't. I remember my landlord, my parents' landlord was a Chinese man, and we had a room in his house. And he got angry at something, so he started jumping up and down. We didn't know what he wanted from us. But some people made friends, I'm sure. I'm sure that there were not amongst the Frume people, but amongst Fry people, there were marriages there with the Chinese.
When you look back, what is your best memory from that Takufa in your life in Shanghai?
My best memory? I'm trying to think. Maybe when I was married, I don't know. Actually, this is because of my mother. I don't have any bad memories. I just remember my mother wasn't well. And I went to school, and when I came from school, I had to do everything. I had to wash, to clean. I was young. I had to wash laundry. I had to boil the laundry in hot water. And yet, I don't, my mother used to say, when people brought us clothes, we were refugees, so she says, Ich bete, Ribono Shel Olam, I ask you, Ribono Shel Olam, that my children should not get used to taking things from other people. Because you can get used to take. So I really don't have sad memories. I remember this, it could be the first night that I slept on the sack thing. And I think this is thanks to my parents. My mother never, I don't know, she didn't make sound life so terrible. And there was always orchim, there were always people, she would make from nothing something. And maybe my father was always sitting and learning, always, day and night. So they didn't carry over. I don't know. I never felt that. And maybe because I didn't dwell on it too much. Because we came to Detroit. We were married there, and a month later we went to Canada, and we came to Detroit. We lived all the years in Detroit. All my other friends from Shanghai were in New York, so it could be that I didn't have time to dwell on it. When you talk about the past and talk about the past. So there is a lot, for instance, what I would like what I'd like to say is that why is the story of Shanghai so popular? Everyone talks about Shanghai. It was only one part of history of the war. There are so many other things, terrible things that happened, that when you think with Shanghai, it's not so. And I think because there were so many miracles there, and because it was done to a cloud, was not done to. There's a lot of nisim happened during the Holocaust, but a lot of them happened to singular people. But here you take a whole cloud, 400 people, maybe more, and you take them from a place where nobody ever got out, and the doors were open, they were able to get out, and they came as a whole, and they traveled as a whole. Did not happen so often. A whole, sure, nisim happened. And another thing which left me is that I always felt that we have a certain responsibility, because why we should have had gone through what the others went through. Because when you think about Shanghai, the Holocaust is 1,000 times worse, maybe even 2,000, maybe 5,000. But so we were saved by, and I think that everyone should realize that they were saved for a reason. So we came to Detroit 50, 60 years ago. My husband built up the yeshiva with the help of others, naturally. I'm teaching for the last 50 years. And so I don't feel bitter. When you hear, because I'm involved with so many people, and you hear from other people all the stories, that it's, I don't know if that answers your question.
It not only answered that question, I think it answered the next two or three. And is from all the girls who you taught, who you made this kind of kesher with, are you in touch with any of them?
They were I taught the little ones. So the wife of Rabbi Chaim Levine, she was a little girl. Ethel, you mentioned Ethel Petzovich. She was one of them. I have a cousin who is now in New York, was one of them. And in fact, I was just in Israel for Sukkot. So a girl came to see me, the one that was there. I mean, I didn't recognize her, but and she was there. And I have friends. That are, as I said, I live in Detroit, and they're all East. So, but there is all the men, especially the yeshivalites, we were all together. So we have. And everyone tried to build, I think. And so all the girls that I taught, they were little girls, and I'm sure there were other teachers that added more and more and more and more. They all built, bote, how do you say, bote nemonim, b'Yisrael. They built, and they all have families. And there were many girls that were that married yeshivalite in Shanghai. The only thing what I want to say is one thing which is really on my mind, that if anyone sees this, and if anyone goes sometimes to Shanghai, and some people go there on business now, there is a Besak forest in Shanghai. I think there were 4 or 5 yeshivalites that died they were sick, and they died in Shanghai. And whenever I think of them being there alone amongst all the Chinese, and I don't know how many Eden there are, and that if anyone goes to Shanghai, they should go look up the Besak forest and say a couple prokim of Tehillim. In fact, somebody just went from Detroit, and I asked him to do it also. Because every time I think of him being that far land, having gone through so much, and being left. The people that came from Shanghai, all the yeshivalites that came back, right? Most of them were already grown men. So many of them, they were in their 30s. They married late. So they were already prepared. They were learned enough to be able to build new things, to do. When you think of the Holocaust, from the people of the Holocaust, either they were old or they were never young, they didn't have a chance to learn so much. So I think this is why, I mean, besides that the people that came from Shanghai, the yeshiva life, they were all, I cannot say they were finished products, but they were all learned, strong men, and they were able to build and they were able to start. I think that's one of the reasons why they were so successful, because most of them were in the yeshivas. And they were able to raise children because of that. That this is why they were so successful. They were strong in their own conviction. You know, when my husband came here, I was just married. We were just married. My husband was already 29. I was 19, right? He was already a finished product and a European mirror yeshiva man. So it built around him. So he built a yeshiva. And I think that's what happens. They were, from the people that came from the Holocaust, a lot of them were young kids. They had to learn. And the parents were, many Snebach were saved, they were no koyach, so they built up businesses. But to go out and the Mira Yeshiva was able to do it. But I think my message to the Bisyakov, to the Bisyakov girls, that, you know, it's so easy now to learn. Everything is before them. I mean, they have other nisyonos, yeah? But the learning, so when we look back and we see what those kids went through, so we have to continue the work that was done before them and so forth.